Well, thank you very much for Charles and Oliver for inviting me to talk to you. And I hope you're not disturbed by the person who seems to be grinding stone outside my front window here. I'm going to talk on very briefly, to tee up, I hope, for the questions on a few topics concerning the internal dynamics in China, what the Sixth Plenum tells us about China, why Xi Jinping is wanting longer in power, just how stable Chinese politics are, whether it's a popular regime and how it legitimizes itself, and the sort of crucial question of whether China will rule the world. So if I start with the Sixth Plenum, which happened at the beginning of last month, or 8th of November, we didn't learn anything very much about the policy from that. That's not the job of the plenum. That comes in other meetings like the Central Economic Work meeting we've just had. But what we did learn about it was fairly obvious in many ways, that Xi Jinping really is top dog, and the opposition, I think, is well, there undoubtedly, because he's offended an awful lot of people, is mute. And I think it underlined that he's bigger than his predecessors. That certainly was his intention, to underline that, with the exception of Mao. And it underlined, again, and it made a great deal of emphasis on the fact that he is the core of the core. So the core is the leadership of the Central Committee, as it were, and the core of that is Xi Jinping. And as a result of what's passed at that conference, if you are going, given in line with sort of democratic centralism, if you are going against the party's line, you are in effect going against Xi Jinping, because he's the core of that line. So I think he's greatly strengthened his hand there. Other takeaways, well, yes, I don't think it's unexpected that the meeting is teeing him up for a third term in office in next year's party congress, and probably quite likely a fourth after that. And the other thing I think to note is that ideology is back. I mean, it's been back for a long time. In fact, I would date the return of ideology and the general tightening up of party and social control back to 2008 and 2009. And that was very evident in the Sixth Plenum documents that came out in the 2011 Sixth Plenum. You only have to read them to see that is the case. So for Xi Jinping, in a 20th century Marxism, of which he's now officially the originator, it's not just the party central, it's now Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a believer. He's a Marxist, and he says so openly. Why does he want to stay longer in power, if that is a correct conclusion to reach? I think it is. Well, if you're a cynic, and of course I am, and cynics are sometimes right, it's very dangerous to step down from power. Power in the Chinese Communist Party is a red tooth and a red claw affair. We've already seen that Xi Jinping broke tradition, if there is one, by prosecuting Zhou Yongkang, who'd been a Politburo Standing Committee member, so one of the top people. So there's always that fear that if you step down, you too may, and certainly your supporters will get into trouble. But perhaps less cynically, I think he thinks that the changes, you can call them reforms if you will, that he wishes to implement have not yet been finished, and he needs more time to ensure that the system reset that he wants is fully in place. And that's, if you look at the politics, well, they've gone backwards in a way. But if you look at social reform, that's changed quite considerably in terms of the heightening of control, internet, education, culture, the surveillance system, very detailed, and the increasing severity of what they call the grid system, a form of social control, which goes right down to the street level. On the economics, well, I'll leave most of that to George, but I will say that I think there's been very little progress compared to the what was announced or expectations announced in the third plenum back in 2013. And that's not just a view from outside. I mean, there's quite an interesting piece, admittedly it was written in 2017 or was published by a Chinese think tank, which was very open about how little progress there'd been on 5 areas of reform, including government finance, centre versus local, the hukou problem, the registration, mobility, which greatly affects mobility, and health, etc. But if you look at things like changes to the retirement age or property tax, these have not moved in a long time, despite being announced. So I think Xi Jinping needs more time. And when it comes to reforms, let's also not forget that the Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist party, and Leninists don't let go of the levers of power, economic or others. And therefore, I think we need to adjust in our minds, if we haven't already, what exactly it means by reform. It is not a move towards our form of economic system and capitalism, a fairly obvious point, I think. How stable are Chinese politics? Well, ever since the last party congress, nearly 4 years ago, the catchphrase has been progress amidst stability. And in the very recent, this month's Central Economic Work Conference, which is a very important meeting, again, stability was the big thing that was emphasized. And, you have to say that it is a much more fragile, I think, regime than perhaps some people would say. I mean, you don't go spending more on your domestic security than you do on your military forces, and put in place this massive, mammoth surveillance and grid systems and societal controls, unless you're a little bit worried about how legitimate you feel and whether there might be outbreaks against the government. And I think that you can see that. I always say that the best metaphor for the way society is in control of it is that inside the pressure cooker, I think the pressure is rising considerably. There is a danger of instability, but also let's not forget that the walls of the pressure cooker are getting thicker. The ability of a modern technical state to survey and, if necessary, control and repress people, I think is growing. But there are a lot of mass incidents, as they call them, protests and riots in China. It was very interesting to watch when they lifted some of the restrictions on the Wuhan COVID, and in one particular county, you had to go through another county to get to the nearest airport. And there was a pitched fight on the bridge involving the police forces on both sides, as well as the locals. It boils up quite quickly. But I think the crucial matter when it comes to stability is what degree of stability is there within the party itself? Because if the party stays united and whole, I think it's got the tools to control instability below. And she has made a lot of enemies. The latest statistics, I can't remember, it's 400 and off the top of my head, 30 something ministerial level cadres have been disciplined, and 3.742 million other officials have been disciplined. That's a phenomenal number of people and a number of their families and supporters who will not be pleased at the varying degrees of discipline, from prison through to just a mild slap on the wrist and lack of promotion prospects. So there's a possibility of disunity, but they are also, as the party, very conscious that if you look at what happened, and they do, in the Soviet Union, one of the reasons why it fell was splits in the top, and they realize that they stand and fall together. So I don't see at the moment any signs of disunity in the party. I think it would take pretty severe economic meltdown for that to happen, possibly a real foreign affairs crisis with the US, but I don't see it on the horizon at the moment. And as for the people, how popular is Xi and how legitimate is the party? Well, I think it's quite popular, actually. I don't think we should underestimate that. It's partly, of course, that the party puts a phenomenal amount of effort and expense into domestic propaganda, and the line that the East is rising and the West declining, and the East, of course, is China, or that the rise of the party is inevitable and irresistible. I think that goes down quite well, particularly when you've spent the last decade building and encouraging nationalism. And the party does consult. It is, in Steve Tsang, professor at SOAS's phrase, consultative Leninism. And that's what the United Front is partly about. I mean, there are 622,000 people working in the People's Political Consultative Conference system. And it consults. It puts up ideas and feelings, and the party takes the temperature. It doesn't always act on them. It acts in its own best interest, usually, but it still consults. And I think it's worth just looking also very briefly, in case you want to come back at me on this, at the way the party legitimizes itself in the eyes of its people. Because what it claims, and I think that if you look at what I call the 6 legitimacies, and that's my enumeration in Chinese Communist Party form, but it's mine, not the party's, you see that these legitimacies lie behind pretty much all of its policy making. And I think it not only explains the way policy goes, but in some ways is a mild predictor of policy. So I would say that the 6 legitimacies are, and as follows: only the party can, number 1, guarantee financial, economic prosperity, a year-on-year rise. And that's been its main legitimacy, of course. Secondly, only the party can make China great again, back to its rightful position where it always has been, at the center of the world. Thirdly, only the party can guarantee territorial integrity, that China gets back all the territory that it rightfully owns. Now, you can argue about that, and so you should, but Xinjiang has come back, Hong Kong and Macau have come back, South China Sea is gradually being pulled back in, and Taiwan is there on the menu. Fourthly, only the party can guarantee cultural respect for China's culture. It's very important to Xi Jinping culture. It comes in just about every single pronouncement and document that he makes. Culture, of course, is very closely allied to ideology and the set of socialist core values that he espouses. Fifthly, only the party can guarantee the best form of governance. I mean, look at the USSR and Eastern Europe, what a shambles their version of communism was. And then look at Brexit and Trump and the mess in America. Democracy doesn't work either, does it? But our form of democracy, whole process democracy, which has been making a lot of recently, that's the real thing. And lastly, and a difficult one for the party, only the party can deal with inequality and the environment, the 2 sort of big threats at the moment. Leave aside how it was that the system perhaps caused those in the first place, but only the party can solve them. So I think if you look at those 6, you will find that they come in every form of, they lie behind almost all forms of governance. And lastly, before I hand over to George, and in a sense, George, I hope you'll forgive me, it's a slight framework, which you may or may not appreciate for what you're going to say. But the question is, will China rule the world? The famous title of Martin Jakes' book, which he wrote so many years ago, and which some China watchers actually entitled, Does Martin Jakes Fool the World? But I wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, and my answer is no. I don't think it'll be the superpower of the 21st century. It may not be a superpower. It will certainly be a power. To be a superpower, you need a very powerful and sustainable economy to afford it all. And I think there are 4 reasons why that is not, why that should be greatly in question. 4 reasons and a question mark. My 4 reasons, and I'll leave it to George to expound on this, but in order of seriousness, starting with the least serious, debt, then demographics, then going up in seriousness, the water crisis, something that I don't think economists and others pay sufficient attention to, but it's very, very serious. Fourthly, whether China has a sufficiently educated workforce. And if you haven't read Scott Rosel's book, Invisible China, where he sets out the arguments for that, please do. In essence, his argument is that no country has escaped the middle income trap unless it's had at least 60% of its workforce educated to the end of secondary education, because you have to have a very high-tech and richer sort of industrial background. You've got to have educated and people who are able to switch skills, learn new skills. And 60% has been the figure for countries that have managed to escape the trap so far. China's is 30%. And that's not something that you can cure within a few years. So those are my 4 reasons, but the question mark is innovation. To what degree will China's, and this is, I think, a question mark that Xi Jinping in a sense has, because he emphasizes it on all occasions, the importance of innovation. China innovates, for sure it does, in the sort of spectrum from the, as it were, the sharp end of innovation, which is invention, through to the lower end of minuscule improvements in process, etc. China hasn't done at all badly, but the question is, can it do it well enough in the future? A lot of studies would say that for that you have to have a much freer culture, a culture that encourages iconoclasm. You have to have a free flow of information, and you have to have the ability to attract talent. I think that's, the jury's out on that one, but I think it's a very important question. And just finally on that, and as to why my pessimism is to the fore in China's ability to have that large, sustainable economy sufficient for it to be a superpower. To deal with those problems that I've laid out, I think you have to have a form of governance that is different from what it has at the moment. Is it possible to control such an enormously big country with such an enormously and increasingly complex economy and society using this top-down model of governance? Xi Jinping has rejected the help of, as it were, things that are automatic or from the bottom up. And that is civic society, which produces so much ideas and pressure in other societies. A free press to ensure that the system works without too much abuse. An independent judiciary, so that if the wheels really come off, things can be gotten back on track, or indeed as a deterrent so they don't go off track. And fourthly, some form of political accountability. It doesn't have to be Westminster democracy or Washington democracy, but it certainly has to be such that political leaders know that if they screw up, they're going to have to pay for it by being chucked out of office. So yeah, I mean, it's hard enough to predict the future, and as the historic resolution at the last plenum showed, it's hard enough to predict the past. So on that note, I'll hand over to George.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Charles, and also to our hosts for having me here to talk to you a little bit as a sort of an interlude before you get to hear Charlie again on the economy. And you won't be perhaps surprised to know that I sort of share many of Charlie's sentiments. And I'd like to kind of kick off really by referring the Economic Work Conference, which he mentioned, and which has just recently concluded, which is taking place obviously ahead of a very important political year for China because of the 20th Party Congress at the end of next year, which must of course go off smoothly and successfully. The work conference, I think a lot of people have kind of latched onto this quite quickly, began really by setting a kind of, very briefly, but began by setting a scene as to where China is at the moment, in which the authors describe as comprising demand contraction, which is they're referring really to what's going on in the real estate sector, weakness in the consumer, and private investment, and of course the consequences of zero COVID. First signs or first cases of Omicron, of course, as you know, have just been discovered in China. Secondly, supply turbulence, which is all the turmoil going on with regards to supply chains, some of which has to do with de-Americanization of China's supply chains by the government. Some of it has to do with what companies are up to, especially foreign companies. And some of it, of course, has to do with what's going on in terms of the global system and the consequences of COVID and of much feistier international relations for the smooth operation of supply chains. And the third factor was what they simply called weakening expectations, which just basically means that people are not very optimistic about the future. And it's against this background that the government or the work conference echoed an earlier call in the week by the Politburo by saying that stability is our top priority. And in order to try to frame the policy context for 2022 and beyond, the authors also talked about a number of things which will be of great interest to business people and to investors up front, not just the sort of decarbonization and environmental issues, which the Chinese are quite conscious about over the medium term. But they talk a lot about common prosperity, which I'll refer later, about the regulation of capital according to what they call a traffic light system, in which they will, I suppose, green will be encouragement, amber will be stricter control, and red will be outright restrictions, where they feel that the consequences of deployment of capital are going to result in too much risk or too much profit. These things, I think, will be very important in framing the business environment and the economic environment as we go forward. I just want to say something about stability, because actually the stability focus is really interesting. It's a concept which is constantly harped on about by Chinese leaders. And I think there are three contrary things about stability, which can all be true. So the first is, given what's happening in the economy, there is going to be stimulus next year to try to stabilize the downturn in the economy. So we've already seen, for example, relaxation of the accounting regulations and balance sheet regulations for property developers, the so-called 3 red lines. We've seen relaxation of mortgage restrictions. We've seen lower interest rates and cuts in reserve requirements. And we have also seen the government give early approval to local governments to step up their borrowing for infrastructure investment at the beginning of 2022. Stability can also mean restraint, funnily enough, because the stated intentions of the work conference documents say that fiscal discipline is to be applied to or conform to, and there will be further additions on, quote, hidden local government debt, unquote, whatever that means. But you won't be surprised to know that for at least 2 or 3 years now, COVID or pandemic notwithstanding, the government has been trying to wean the economy away from its dependence on indebtedness. So it can mean stimulus to stabilize the downturn. It can mean restraint to stabilize financial risk. It can also mean more instability in the future. It's something that we learned in so-called liberal-leaning democracies or Western economies in the 2000s, is that the more you try to stabilize an economic system, the more you actually fundamentally make that system more vulnerable to instability. Because if you avoid painful decisions about debt, write-offs, bad loans, all the kind of awkward things that you have to do to wean yourself away from debt, all you end up doing is creating a rollover, what in financial markets people call extend and pretend, in which you just kind of roll the problem into the future. And you have to deal with it at some point in the future. And that point, I think, has come in China. And by continuing to inflate, as it were, the bubble into 2022, which is what the government may well end up doing, it just means that there's a bigger risk for them when they come around to deal with it again in 2023 or 2024. But so far as the immediate future is concerned, I think, we are going to see, we won't know this for sure until the spring at the National People's Congress, but it's rumored that the GDP target for next year is going to be somewhere between 5 and 5.5%, given that the end of 2021 is going to end up with a year-on-year growth in the economy of somewhere around 3% plus or minus. Obviously, there's a lot of heavy lifting to do in order to get back up to 5 or 5.5%. So the outlook for 2022 is a little bit murky, but I think we should give the benefit of doubt to the idea that the government will relax on its restrictive policy, allow the economy a little bit more headway, maybe uneconomic headway, but I think they'll give it that headway. Whatever happens next year, though, the medium and longer term view, I think, about China's economy, I think will revolve around three key things. First, a much more pedestrian rate of economic growth, let's say about 3.5%, with periods sometimes when it's a bit higher, sometimes much lower. The second is the government's probably impossible task of evolving what they want, which is a new development model to deliver lofty ambition, but also to overcome its self-made contradiction. Leninist parties love to talk about contradictions, which means that they can have a discussion about how dialectically to resolve conflicting forces in society. But there's a new contradiction which is self-made, but which hasn't really been articulated by the party, which is the contradiction between the party's passion for control and stability and its repressive and controlling governance regime in which the private sector is being brought to heel. I mean, I've called this kind of a takeover from the inside, because you don't actually have to nationalize private companies or punish all the entrepreneurs or anything like that. You just do it a few times and make it known what is expected of you in order to avoid regulatory backlash or something like that. And you can actually get the private companies to behave and to conform. And actually that is certainly a kind of a detriment to the outlook for innovation and productivity. And the third, which ties in from this or derives from it really, is the likelihood that China will get stuck in what we call a middle income trap, which is the capacity, as you know, for most emerging and developing countries that have grown out of poverty to basically get stuck at a certain level of income per capita, where they may make progress in absolute terms, but their relative performance compared to, say, developed markets or rich economies never really improves that much. Getting out of the middle income trap is all about productivity, because once you've exploited your physical kind of resources of labor and capital, you have to have smarter growth. Smarter growth is basically more productivity. And more productivity, I think development economists generally agree, is functionally related to more inclusive and high quality institutions, legal, competition, regulatory, educational, labor markets, capital markets, all of which are pretty much off limits to Xi Jinping's Communist Party, not interested in doing these kinds of things in ways that certainly we would consider almost inevitable as something that should happen, but which the government doesn't really want to. So we talked a little bit already, or Charlie did at least, about some of the kind of more and less pressing problems in China. The debt problem, I think, is a big problem because most emerging countries cannot get through development without encountering balance sheet crises, sometimes more than once. And China certainly is overdue and it's starting to happen, of course, as you know, in the property market, which is a $60 trillion market. It's 4 times GDP. It contributes somewhere between 23 and 29% of annual growth. There's oversupply of property relative to income per head. You know, there's as much floor space of property in China as there is in the UK, France, and Germany. despite China having about a fifth of the income per capita. High vacancy rates, big problems of affordability outside tier 1 cities, and local governments are going to be much more financially constrained. The demographics are poor. They're not crisis forming, but they're poor. Fertility rate is only about 1.3. The population of first-time home purchase age, which is, let's say, 25 to 39, is going to drop by about a quarter over the next 15, 20 years. And productivity is the kind of the holy grail that we're all after, China included. It's, in China's case in particular, productivity is strongly correlated with periods of liberalizing reform that we've seen when reform and opening up really meant reform and opening up. And while the government obviously continues to pay lip service to reform and opening up, there isn't really a lot of that going on. There is reform, but it's not the kind of liberal reform that we associate with more dynamic private firms and innovation. The second big problem, apart from these macroeconomic constraints, is the fact that there isn't really an alternative growth model that the government is willing to buy into. They've talked a lot last year about something called dual circulation strategy, which didn't really make any appearance in recent government documentation, but it's basically a code really for self-reliance and for doing more things at home, like semiconductors, like primary products, for example, that previously they have been and are reliant on American or Korean or Japanese or German countries for. They talked a lot this year about a revived slogan that first saw the light of day under Mao and then under Deng Xiaoping, called common prosperity. It's certainly a well-articulated political slogan designed to focus the party and citizens on inequality and on what the Marxists have basically kind of call the social relations of production. So, you know, for many, many decades, China has been focused on the forces of production, which is basically code for growth. Now they're focused on the social relations of production, which is really about the position of, you know, different sort of power centers, as it were, within the kind of economic construct. And so this is really about private firms, entrepreneurs, inequality, who controls the environment and to what end. And we should expect to hear more about that, I think, during the coming year or so. But as yet, I think there's very little that the government has embraced that would give us confidence about what it means economically. They've talked a lot about tertiary distribution. So primary distribution is about wages and salaries. Secondary distribution is about taxes and transfers. Tertiary distribution is about corporate donations. So I think this is just a form of coercive corporate philanthropy, which is, you know, in which companies like Alibaba and Tencent have been making very, very large contributions to party causes and valued projects. And the idea behind this is that companies need to pay attention to their moral and social responsibilities, as well as to their commercial responsibilities as well. And if they don't, you know, they could end up in trouble, or their entrepreneurs could be targeted as well. So keep an eye open for what common prosperity, what flesh is put on the kind of political bones. But certainly the regulatory blizzard that we've seen this year, or indeed since the cancellation of the Ant IPO last November, is certainly a taste of what the government intends. Each regulation, if you want to put it that way, or each regulatory intervention on its own looks like a perfectly normal and, you know, acceptable thing to do, particularly regulation of data, privacy, storage, and all this kind of stuff. But actually taken together, it does represent probably the most, I would say, egregious advance in the states and parties' control of the economy, and it was pretty high already, that we've seen since the Mao era. And I think in that sense, we should be, and businesses should be extremely cognizant of the fact that if you are in China running a business, or you do business with China, or you invest in China, you simply have to be very aware and adept at figuring out what it is that Xi Jinping is planning to do next in terms of regulation and intervention, and how you as an investor or as a corporate can respond flexibly and nimbly to those interventions. And in the same breath, obviously, making sure that you don't basically follow, Chinese regulations and flout those at home, where you could be brought into conflict with shareholders and local laws. Not all sectors are similarly affected. I mean, you think that if you're in chosen sectors like semiconductors or artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, consumer cyclicals, you should get off relatively lightly compared with if you're in a very sensitive sector like healthcare or housing or anything to do with data storage, manipulation, or anything like that. But obviously, we are all concerned, I mean, not just the Chinese, but we as well, about national security. And national security now covers a whole spectrum of activities, from data and finance and technology to supply chains, biodiversity, and ideology. And so I think all of these things actually contribute to a kind of a focus on how the Chinese governance system, which I think is the bottom line really, is changing in ways which are incompatible, in my judgment, with the lofty economic ambitions which China has set and certainly intends to try to pursue and to achieve. But I think that we will find, and businesses I think will find, that life becomes increasingly difficult, tense, particularly where you are drawn into the crosshairs, really, where your home laws and regulations conflict with those that are implemented in China, and where investment in China actually becomes something that is inevitably going to be accompanied by some sort of feedback from shareholders or from groups, lobbying groups at home, to complain about obviously the adversarial nature of the relationship, which is obviously focusing very much around values and so on. So with that, I'll kind of move back to Charlie, who can tell us all the things that he left out the first time.
Well, thank you, George. There wouldn't be enough time for that. On external relations, I just want to talk about a couple of overarching themes. The first is the D word, decoupling or divergence, depending on your on the degree. Secondly, the degree to which China is trying to change the world. And then a very quick word on three outstanding or obvious problems: Taiwan and the South China Sea, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. And so let's start with the D word. It's not a new Cold War for the very obvious reasons that the Soviet Union wasn't a partner for trading and investment. We didn't work with it on science and technology, and it wasn't really relevant to the sort of global goods like pandemics and climate change. But all those apply very much to China. And so our overall aim must be to maximize good relations with China in both our interests. But at the same time, I think we have to accept that even if we don't use the words Cold War with capital letters, we might need to use them with small letters, or call it a systems war or a values struggle, whatever you like. There isn't a good word, but it's real and it's there. And I think leaving aside what happens on, as it were, this side of the relationship, that is to say, the free countries, America and Europe, because people always seem to talk about decoupling as an American phenomenon. My line will be, well, no, let's look at what it's like from the other side of the curtain, as it were, and seek through truth from facts from what the party says and does, because it's great on many of the slogans like win-win or a community of shared future for mankind or Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a slogan. But actually, let's look beneath that, because when you do, then there are plenty of examples where the Chinese Communist Party itself is pushing divergence or decoupling. Obvious examples are things like internet governance, the use of cyber as an attack weapon, data laws, you know, I'm going to apply the reciprocity test. What industries and areas are we allowed in China compared to what they are allowed in here? Telecommunications is wherever possible, the Chinese keep us out. So they are very much intent on diverging. And indeed, George mentioned the dual circulation strategy, which, if you would put it in one sentence, you would say that then it's domestic where we can and foreign where we really must. But I said, you know, look at things like, you know, look at what Xi Jinping actually says, what the Communist Party says to itself about this question. And if you go back to the 5th of January 2013 and read Xi Jinping's very first speech to the Politburo just after coming to power, he talks about Chinese socialism gaining the dominant position over Western capitalism. It's quite a strong phrase in Chinese. And frequently they talk about strategic initiative, which has quite a strong military context in Chinese. And then only a few months later, after that January speech, in April 2013, out came document number 9. It was a secret document, it was leaked, and it talks about the 7 don't speaks, Qibujiang, and those are all the things, the values that we stand for, whether that's the sorts of constitutionalism that we have, freedom of the press, independent judiciary, etc., universal values, etc., etc. So that is a declaration that the value system that they pursue and wish to expand, I think, is very antithetical to ours. And ever since then, again, if you spend your life reading Chinese documents, as I do, it's a sad way of going about, I know, but nevertheless, you'll see words like struggle, hostile foreign forces, and this is, you know, right up to the present day. I mean, Chen Yixin, who's Secretary General of the Politics and Legal Commission, which is basically in charge of this security and police, etc., in an article at the end of November, again, talks about all these Western values that must be resisted and combated. So there's, you know, while we want good relations with China, we have to raise an awareness and our defenses against what's coming out of China. Is China trying to change the world? If you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, in terms of sort of exporting its model, I'd have said, well, not especially. It's obviously trying to make the world safe, the Chinese Communist Party. You know, all countries try and ensure that there isn't a level playing field. Who wants a level playing field? I mean, I'd far rather it was tipped grossly in favor of my country, but and you can hardly blame them for wanting to do the same. And of course, within technology, exports and various other things are embedded values. And a desire, I think, to change some aspects of global governance more to suit themselves. Why not? But that, I think, has changed really quite dramatically in the last few years. As I read the documents and the speeches, you start hearing things about you know, providing the Chinese system the Communist Party system must provide Chinese ideas to the world in terms of modern party politics and offer a new model for global political progress. It's, I think, now gotten to a stage where it is right to think that there is an ideological struggle which will affect the global governance systems far more than it would have done some years before. So we need to be aware of that. You know, perhaps one could say, well, no one, with the possible exception of Alexander the Great, sets out to get an empire, but somehow along the way, if you push in certain directions hard enough, one accretes to you. And it's clearly in our interests that we do maintain the sorts of open and liberal forms of governance that have hitherto held sway. So I think China is trying to change the world. A couple of remarks then on certain specific areas. Everyone keeps saying, well, will the Chinese Communist Party invade Taiwan? And I've written a long paper on this at the Council of Geostrategy. It's free, go and have a look at it, and it'll tell you in great detail about why it won't invade by 2030, in my view. If you want to grasp at straws, you can look at words in the historic resolution of this last month, where they even talk about patience. I'm not sure I put too much stress on that, but there are plenty of very good reasons why China will not invade Taiwan. I mean, first of all, militarily, it's just too risky. There are 13 beaches which you could land on. It's 100 miles of, and they're easily defended incidentally, 100 miles of very quite dangerous sea. And even if you were, then what about if you were foolish enough to try that? What about the US reaction? What about Taiwan's hedgehog defense and actually consuming the territory once you perhaps manage to capture it? So I think there are very good military reasons why they're not up to it yet. And let's not forget that China has no military experience since 1979 when it invaded Vietnam and lost. But those probably aren't nearly as important as the other reasons. Secondly, semiconductors. An invasion is almost certainly going to destroy the semiconductor industry, which is largely based in Taiwan. And just imagine the economic consequences of that to China, but also, of course, to us. And thirdly, I think it's almost inconceivable that the US and Europe and other free countries would not impose embargoes and sanctions upon China if it took forceful measures to regain, no, not regain, because it's never held, to gain Taiwan. And again, you can follow back what would happen to that. China's economy is still 20% based on exports. It still welcomes and needs investment. It still welcomes other forms of trade and interaction. All that stops. Massive unemployment in China, an unsatisfactory social security net equals dissatisfaction, equals riots, and guess who you have to blame? There's no one else except the Communist Party. If I can work that logic out, so can the party. Question, well, does sometimes logic go out the window when things get really bad and you want a distraction for your populace? I don't think it will, because it would simply and very quickly make the distraction, the situation from which you needed to be distracted, even worse. So I think that there are other forms. I think we're going to see very much continued tension in the region for obvious reasons. Taiwanese, fewer and fewer, support any form of unification. The distance between them is growing. We're going to see more subversion, united front work, forms of pressure, economic levers, probably the tightening up of the succession law so that it becomes much more like the Hong Kong national security law. And so that tension is not good for any of us. And in terms of the South China Sea and Taiwan and America, let's not forget that while the South China Sea and therefore Taiwan's part in it as an integral part of the first island chain, for China, regional security, Taiwan, very important. But it's also very important strategically for the US. If it's to have any power in the Western Pacific, it cannot afford to lose the first island chain, and Taiwan is a massive part of that. But beyond that, of course, semiconductors matter to the US and everyone else just as much as they do to China. And so do values, so do 24 million people who freely voted for their own system of governance. So it matters massively to China, it matters massively to the US, it matters massively to Japan, and it matters to us too from the point of view of the observance of international law, which is why I think the UK government is keen to keep sending ships through that area, even if it causes tension, and will continue to do so. Xinjiang, well, you saw the Uyghur Tribunal's verdict last week, genocide on one of the 5 counts of genocide. Yes, it's not extermination, but it is genocide in terms of the forceful suppression of births. Genocide, crimes against humanity, I don't think it vastly matters. I think perhaps we should focus on crimes against humanity, of which 7 out of 11 clearly apply. Take your pick, but it's it's something that I think increasingly the world will not be able to overlook. Monsieur Macron may be able to go to the Olympics or send a French person to it, and Mr. Guterres of the UN bizarrely doesn't seem to be too keen on protecting the UN conventions, this one on genocide. But I think that is going to grow and is going to be an increasing reason for divergence between us. And when it comes to companies, the pressure is going to increase, as I think George also, for other reasons as well, specified. I think that the mood is swinging quite rightly very much against genocide and crimes against humanity. And there will be demands on companies to ensure that their supply lines and sourcing is much cleaner. Difficult to necessarily to get the information from within China, but not so difficult actually, either through open source work, finding out, for instance, which companies are connected to the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation, which owns a phenomenal amount of the industry there, and you know, technology, for instance. I could take my Marks and Spencer's shirt to, there's a new technology which will tell me within a few hundred meters where the cotton was made anywhere in the world. You can get at it from this end of the supply chain, and a little bit of testing here and there would say to someone like Marks and Spencer's, you're using Xinjiang cotton, you are falling foul of our regulations in our country. Forget it on China. So you're going to have these tensions as China puts more pressure on companies, but also you're going to find more pressure from this end. On Hong Kong, well, the intention always was within China that Hong Kong will become no different from any other Chinese city, but the date was set for 2047. It was 50 years without change. That has clearly been moved forward. The riots and protests of 2019 cut across China's 3 red lines, as we defined them, and the national security law and other measures have moved Hong Kong very much towards just being another Chinese city. But 2 questions arise in my mind, and the first is one which perhaps many of you will be able to answer better than I. To what degree does Hong Kong retain elements of itself that cannot be reproduced elsewhere in the Greater Bay Area or within China? I mean, obvious one, of course, is the question of the liberalization of the RMB and the fact that Hong Kong stands outside, as it were, that wall. I mean, I personally, and George will, I suspect, be of the same opinion, I'm sure he is, that the RMB is not going to be liberalized in the next 5 or more years. China is not going to open its current account for various good reasons. But again, you guys, many of you from financial will be able to answer that question better than I. The second question is, what's going to happen to the system of law? Because I find it difficult to conceive that by 2047, the common law system will be allowed to continue. If there's one country and one system, and it's already moving that way, but it certainly will be by then you have to get rid of the common law. But 2047 is not the date for that. It's almost certainly going to be 2030 to 2032. The reason why the negotiations on Hong Kong for the handover started, for the handover in 1997, started in 1982, was because most property leases and contracts in Hong Kong were 15 years. So people weren't going to invest not knowing what the legal system was going to be after 1997. I wonder whether that doesn't apply now. If most contracts are around about 15 years, not all, but most, then people are going to want legal certainty well before 2047. And 15 from 47 is 32. You might want it a little earlier than that. So questions, I don't know the answer. And finally, when it comes to China, of course, the National Security Investment Act was not drawn up with China specifically in mind, but any particular threat. But it does come into action in January. And companies will need, if they're not already, to be very aware of what its specifications are, because if it's properly enforced, and that's an if, it will have a great effect vis-a-vis trade with China.
Okay, thank you very much. Oliver, do you want to moderate the Q&A, please?
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Thank you, George. We've got a few interesting questions here. I'll try to group them together where that makes sense. First question from John Mayer at the EBRD, which I think, Charlie, you were touching on elements of at the end there, where John says, does China want to be accepted as an equal to, say, the US, Russia, the EU, or does it want to be more powerful in any context? i.e., does it want to be sustainably successful, or does it want to take on or take over others? What sort of powerful would it like to be? First question.
Shall I go first, George, and then?
Sure. I mean, in the interest of time, I mean, if I agree with you, I'll just say pass.
Well, I'll deliberately leave some gap then, George. Certainly, it wishes to be equal, and certainly it wishes to ensure that the USA doesn't infringe on any of its areas of interest, which means the successful continuation of the CCCP in power ultimately, but that depends upon the 6 legitimacies that I sketched out, I think. So if in any way the USA is pushing against any of those and making them more difficult to attain, then China will push back very hard against the USA. I mean, does it want to have an empire or whatever? No, it wouldn't frame it in that way, but it does wish to have the ability to act as it will and for its own preservation. So I think that's the yardstick.
Yeah, most of us. I mean, I think there is an ambition to reorder the world order and to replicate, if not indirectly, if not directly, the governance system at home in international institutions, and to win or have the support and compliance of countries in the wider world. I think for me that's a pretty clear ambition.
Thank you both. Okay. 2 similar questions here about a debt crisis. So one, how would a Chinese debt crisis affect the West? And then similarly, would a Chinese debt crisis represent a significant enough shock to the CCP to see cracks emerge which could threaten stability?
Yeah, sure. So we have to define what we mean by crisis. I mean, I suspect that crisis does not mean the kind of crisis that we had in 2008 with sort of capped by Lehman, because the government basically controls all of the actors in the financial system. It can parcel around liabilities and assets as it sees fit. And so to the extent that it doesn't or won't allow any major institutions to fail, and it'll provide liquidity willy-nilly to the extent that it can and must. I don't think that that China's debt crisis is going to be like that. I don't think it's going to be like the debt crises that we've seen in Thailand, Russia, Argentina, and Turkey, and a cast of many others, because most of China's debt is denominated in yuan, owned by yuan owners, and in that sense, it's much more like Japan in 1989 and what followed than it is, or America in 2007, than it is of any other kind of emerging country. So the crisis, quote unquote, may not be defined in terms of a financial implosion in which institutions fail, but rather just how they bear and allocate the costs of bad debt and what the payback in terms of economic growth is. And in that sense, I think Japan does provide a model. Does it affect the West in any way? Yes, of course it does. If you're selling copper, iron ore, basic commodities to China, you'll know all about it and may even now begin to feel some of those pressures. If China's economy grows by a much, much lower rate over the next 10 or 15 years, then obviously its imports will be much reduced in terms of growth. And so if you're selling into the Chinese, consumer market or industrial market, you'll know all about that. And could it open cracks in Chinese political system? Well, if mishandled, or if there are policy errors, Of course it could. And it might be, as I think, Charlie also alluded to in his opening remarks, that if if Xi Jinping kind of bears the brunt of criticism for losing the economy, so to speak, because of disappointment, then of course that could have political consequences too. But we are at an inflection point with regards to debt, I think, and how it plays out is, all we know is, it's very unlikely to be Lehman's and it's very unlikely to be Argentina. Much more likely to be a kind of Japanese type model, but that in itself is costly.
George, I'll just add one thing there, because it's much more on your territory than mine, is that I don't think we should ignore also the external position and China's external liabilities. But everyone assumes that with these vast foreign exchange reserves, it's not a problem. And I'm not suggesting it's a vast problem, but there are very considerable liabilities abroad, and you couldn't, of course, mobilize all those foreign exchanges without affecting their value, start selling US treasuries. So I think we are seeing China reining in its horns in terms of its lending abroad as some of those debts go bad. And you do have to ask yourself, and I'd love to see a really good economic balance sheet made of this, is to what degree can China afford all the things that it's doing, both domestically but abroad?
Yeah, I think a big issue there, of course, is the RMB would be vulnerable in those circumstances. But remember, China has a very kind of complex system of capital controls, which it is not going to relax, which kind of feeds back into something else you mentioned as to why the RMB cannot become kind of a major international currency, because nobody can really build up claims on China because of the capital controls.
Great, thank you both. Question from Peter Gordon-Finlayson. Given the increasing centralization of Xi at the core of the party and the party's role in stability, his eventual death is presumably becoming an increasing risk to Chinese stability. What would happen if he died?
Well, shall I go there first, George, and chime in?
You want the font here?
Yeah, I mean, clearly he hasn't laid a successor, made clear what succession there is in the way that has happened in the past. And I think that given the nature, as I said right at the beginning, that Chinese politics is red tooth and red claw and can get very, very nasty, and indeed got quite nasty at the start of Xi Jinping's own ascension to power, what with the Bo Xilai case and the Zhou Yongkang and four others that they listed as people who had indulged in factionalism. There's always that possibility that there could be trouble if allied to serious problems, let's say, in society and in the economy, which would accentuate that. So yeah, it will be a real struggle, and they're not starting from a position where someone has been put in the head and ahead and given a leg up to keep the inevitable fighting down. So, but would it lead to a civil war, or as it were, a political civil war? I think they'd have to keep it, as I said earlier, in check, because they know that if it gets out of hand, they could all be swept away. It's come pretty close at times. It did in '89, for instance. That was a big lesson to them.
Thank you. George, anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add.
Yeah. Just a different theme now. Just picking up on the points about sort of crimes against humanity. William Sandover asks, is China now in the Islamist sights? Charlie, do you have any views on that?
What's amazing is that no Muslim country, I'm not talking here about Islamists, has come out loudly for what is going on in Xinjiang, and one wonders how long that can continue. Whether or not China is within the Islamist sites, and certainly it has been there have been terror attacks in Pakistan, for instance. In terms within China's borders, in particular within, say, Xinjiang, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to take action there. Those borders are very remote, but actually reasonably, these days, I suspect, with technology, able to be monitored. And even if someone either got into to Xinjiang or within Xinjiang was radicalized and wished to take action, the extraordinary power of the integrated, the joint, I always get it wrong, but joint operated platform in terms of surveillance and repression within Xinjiang would make it extremely difficult to move from the border anywhere where you would launch an attack without being spotted, or to make it local. So Islamists, if they are going to target China, it will be outside China, I suspect, rather than inside. There's been some of that. There will probably be more, but I'm not an Islamist expert, but I suspect that still America is the great Satan compared to China.
Thank you. We'll move on to another question. Now we've got about 4 minutes left. I think we've got a hard stop at 15:15, so I'll just try to squeeze a few more in rapid fire. A question here: is any level of Chinese investment in the UK tech sector acceptable, given their propensity to steal IP? Perhaps an emotive question.
I think Charlie should go first. He's written a paper on this.
Well, sorry if I keep going first, George. I think it's got to be looked at very carefully because the boundary between civilian and military technologies and repression technologies is rapidly eroding, and we should not be helping potentially hostile power in one might say already, but certainly in decades to come. Nor should we be reinforcing surveillance and repression systems which grossly offend human rights. So what I've been calling for continually is the proper, as it were, policing of the hiring of our brains, our universities, and the buying of our brains of our companies. The NSIA will go some way, I think, towards the buying end of our brains if it's properly structured and implemented, but I don't think we've got anywhere near where we should be on the hiring of our brains. And there are examples, some of which I won't go into, but I suspect might be emerging soon, which are truly horrifying in terms of the laxity of our academia. And you have to ask yourself, why are we allowing companies like Huawei and Hikvision the sorts of latitude they are in terms of cooperating, hiring our academic brains, for instance? I mean, Huawei has had a very large number of investments in our universities for things like drone technology, gait recognition. I mean, gait recognition is far more powerful even than facial recognition, identifying individuals in poor light, etc. When we know that Huawei has 3 joint laboratories of the Public Security Bureau in Xinjiang, certain laboratories there, and Hikvision is very greatly involved, but there are lots of others. And I think there's a really big question there that needs proper activity to stop it.
Yeah, just to supplement, I would say, you know, this is an issue, obviously, not just for the British government, but also for European governments and for the United States and many others. And as I alluded to before, you know, because national security is now no longer just about tanks and, you know, internal security, it's about a whole range of economic, technological, data-related interests, which basically define, you know, who we are and, you know, what we value and how we go about doing things. I think it's going to become an increasingly hot topic. I mean, it doesn't really apply in the case of the United Kingdom, but because the Chinese don't want the Americans to have access to data which their firms that are listed there have, and because the Americans want access to that data for accounting regulation purposes and transparency, I mean, the likelihood is, you know, we're going to see delistings continue, and you know, the chances of actually meaningful modern, you know, digitized Chinese companies listing on American exchanges in the future, I think is pretty low, as they kind of are encouraged to list again, either in Hong Kong or in Shanghai or Shenzhen. So we're already seeing a sort of a bifurcation in terms of capital markets because of this. And I think I think it applies also in terms of trade and relations with technology. I mean, I think well, a British government minister, I can't remember whether it was the PM or somebody else, said something even quite recently about, you know, that we should allow, you know, welcome, maybe it was Liz Truss, this kind of thing she would say, that, you know, we should allow, you know, Chinese firms access to our companies, you know, provided they don't breach national security. I mean, obviously, what is national security? Who's defining it? How is it defined? But I think it is becoming an increasingly sensitive topic, which I think, I can't remember what the questioner said, whether we should or whether we would prevent access, but I certainly think we will.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I think we've reached time now on for the Q&A, so we'll wrap that up. I'll pass it back to Charles, but thank you very much for all your interesting answers.